A massive mistake people have made in fantasy football for years now is buying low on the year two guy that didn't work out as a rookie. I mean, from time and time again, if you just went through and avoided Corey Davis after his rookie season, didn't draft N'Keal Harry after his rookie year, I mean, you have printed money. The amount of times that you've had a player just absolutely fall flat on their face and then rebound, such as like Devontae Adams, it's far and few between. So what I want to do is I want to look at those guys that had disappointing rookie seasons and identify should you or should you not draft them from a statistical perspective. Now, of course, fantasy football isn't just about using previous statistics to project out into the future, but it's going to be the baseline starting point, and then we're going to look at the catalyst for these guys and their situations to see if we can expect something different from the norm. So the best example we're going to get before we get to the receivers is going to be with the Mr. Bryce Young, because obviously you have a very cheap Carolina Panthers offense right now in underdog drafts. You have Jonathan Brooks, the RB1, who I believe to be a great talent, going in round 8 of drafts. You have Xavier Legette, a wide receiver that was just drafted as a wide receiver 1, going past like wide receiver 50. You have Adam Thielen in the wide receiver 75-ish range. I mean, nobody here is exciting in Carolina, at least on the surface. And the reason for this is if you go look at what Bryce Young did in year 1, Bryce Young was a quarterback that was at about 12.5 fantasy points per game, was at about 4.5 adjusted yards per pass attempt, which is unbelievably bad, like unbelievably bad. There were running backs more efficient than Bryce Young was last year running the football, and obviously the NFL is a passing game. You had Bryce Young less than 200 passing yards. Bryce Young obviously not a super big rusher of the football, but what I wanted to do is I wanted to look at rookie quarterbacks that posted similar years to Bryce Young and see what they did the following season. So if we were looking at quarterbacks that as rookies average about 10.5 to 14.5 fantasy points per contest, about 2.5 adjusted yards per pass attempt to 6.5 adjusted yards per pass attempt. That's going to be yards per pass attempt, but also including touchdowns, interceptions, so skewing it just a bit. Looking at quarterbacks that average anywhere between 155 passing yards per game and 215 passing yards per game, and looking at quarterbacks that were between 5 and 25 rushing yards per game, you had 20 total guys going back to the year 2000, according to the RotoViz screener, hit this with at minimum 8 games played. And looking at what they did the following season, there were 3 instances of quarterbacks that were actually able to finish as a quarterback 1 the following year. That was more than 18.3 points per game. Those examples were Mitchell Trubisky, Trevor Lawrence, and Josh Freeman. Now, going over and moving the baseline down just a bit, because right now, I mean, Bryce Young is not really even being drafted as a QB2 on Underdog. Bryce Young's being drafted as a QB3. He's going as the quarterback 25 off the board. So, I mean, hell, if he's like a top 20 option, that's pretty solid. So we're looking at quarterbacks that average more than 15.9 fantasy points per game the following season. It's good for a QB2 finish. You had Trubisky, Lawrence, Josh Freeman, as we already discussed. But really the only guy that you add in is going to be Ryan Tannehill. So you have about a 28.5% chance to be a quarterback too. So the numbers say that Bryce Young, more likely than not, is not even a top 24 quarterback in fantasy football this next season. But obviously, this isn't the entire story. That's the baseline. We also have to look at the catalyst and see how the situation has changed and maybe go, okay, instead of him having a 28.5% chance to be a QB2, instead of him having a 21% chance to be a QB1, maybe the numbers should be juiced a bit based off his situation changing, and his situation should be much better this year than it was the year prior. Now, I will say, it's still going to be pretty gross. If we go ahead and if we look at this, the main changes, obviously, is going to come with the coaching staff. You have Dave Canales coming over. This is a coach that everybody is really excited for. He was back in the aired out Russell Wilson era in Seattle. He was the quarterback's coach. He was the passing game coordinator in 2020 and 2021. He's the quarterback's coach in 2022. He kind of resurrected Geno Smith's career. Then he moves over to Tampa last season. He kind of resurrects Baker Mayfield's career. And now he's going over to Carolina, where people think that he can resurrect or, just save Bryce Young's career here. Now, not only do you have the coaching staff change, which can really only be good for Carolina in comparison to what they had last season, right? But also, this is a team that this offseason significantly invested into both their offensive line and the weapons for Bryce Young. This team in free agency signs Robert Hunt. Now, I am not an offensive lineman guru. I would love to tell you that I am. The truth of the matter is I'm not, but we can look at the dollars invested in the position, and I can see, okay, they spent $63 million guaranteed on a guard. Robert Hunt's probably a pretty damn good guard, and this is probably going to improve the offensive line. They signed Damian Lewis to $26 million guaranteed, so just completely redoing the interior offensive line here. That's another guard. They get a depth tackle, and then they go into the NFL draft. They draft a wide receiver round 1, Xavier Legette. Now, a full transparency, I'm not a big Xavier Legette fan. Then they go and they take Jonathan Brooks round 2. I am a big Jonathan Brooks fan, but obviously Brooks dealing with an injury. And then you have Jatavion Sanders round 4. Hook 'em horns. I mean, hell, you need a tight end, a rookie tight end we're not expecting much from. But if we're looking at Carolina right now, if I was in a regular redraft league, am I excited about Bryce Young? Hell no. Well, looking at these numbers here, more likely than not, Bryce Young is an NFL bust, and more likely than not, even if we take in consideration the catalyst, Bryce Young's probably not a top 20 fantasy quarterback this season, especially with the fact that he doesn't have the rushing upside. But if you're looking at the cost that you would have to pay for these Carolina Panthers, I think specifically in underdog drafts, people kind of already understand this, and they are at a very reasonable expectation as of today. So if I was in a regular redraft league, am I drafting Jonathan Brooks? Am I drafting Xavier Legette? Am I drafting Bryce Young? No. In your ESPN league with your buddies, don't even worry about it. Specifically in an underdog draft where these guys are so cheap, though, I do think that the discount is warranted if you believe that the coaching staff change is going to fuel Bryce Young in a positive way in year 2. And like we said, these guys are extremely cheap. But if you are looking at what Las Vegas sportsbooks are currently projecting out, they do have Carolina as the 3rd worst offense in the NFL at the moment. So that is pretty damn scary. Now, going over to the wide receivers. We talked about this in Dynasty already, specifically with Jackson Smith-Njigba and Quinton Johnson. But it's very interesting that there is this rule that's floated out, just in case you haven't heard about it. I mean, everybody freaking talks about this. That if a wide receiver does not hit 525 receiving yards their rookie season, they're toast, they're not going to make it, blah, 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 blah. It's a big thing. And you had 2 round 1 guys last year that were right at that mark. Quinton Johnson did not hit 525 receiving yards. Jackson Smith-Njigba did hit 525 receiving yards. Now, instead of just looking at that arbitrary yardage number, what I think is a lot more useful is to look at their season, look for historical comps as rookies, and see the expected hit rate, and then obviously take into consideration how the situation was as a rookie and how the situation may be different in year 2. So just as a little bit of an honest marker here, I liked both these wide receivers as prospects. As prospects, you were looking at Quinton Johnson saying, okay, he breaks out as a true freshman, he dominates as a true sophomore, declares as a true junior, and then he goes round 1 in the NFL draft to a great quarterback. We can kind of say the same thing with Jackson Smith-Njigba, where you get an early career breakout and an early career declare. He goes round 1 of the NFL draft, and he dominated against top competition such as Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave. We'll get into that in just 1 second. So both of them have very disappointing years in year 1. And then going into year 2, the expectations are pretty damn low. You can see this both with their current ADP as well as just the underdog pick'ems that are out there. Quinton Johnson's at 3.5 receiving touchdowns, higher, lower on underdog, about 600 receiving yards, higher, lower. Going over to Jackson Smith-Njigba. Jackson Smith-Njigba's at 4.5 receiving touchdowns, higher, lower. He's at 775.5 receiving yards. So obviously expectations are going to be higher for JSN than what you have with Quinton Johnson. And JSN did have a much better rookie season. But like I said, this is kind of being priced in. You can look at this with underdog ADP as well, where Quinton Johnson right now is going past pick 150 regularly, whereas JSN is someone that you're going to have to take in round 7, round 6-ish, right? So really big gap between these two guys. I will say, I think JSN had a much better rookie season. But as we get into them, please, I mean, if you want to go check out their pick'ems, if you think Quinton Johnson is not going to get anywhere close to 600 receiving yards, you can find that on Underdog Fantasy. You can draft these guys on Underdog. Y'all know I'm drafting there every single night on the live stream. I have done it every day for years. I'm going to do it every day on the live stream this season because it's best ball. There's no time commitment at all during the year. So I won $150,000 on Underdog 2 years ago. And yeah, if you want to check that out, you can find the link in the description, in the comment section. Code FLOCK would hook you up with our 2024 rankings, our 2024 draft guide. And on top of that, Code FLOCK is going to get you a 50% deposit bonus up to $250 on a new account. And Underdog's available in damn near every state. You can see the map here. But anyway, going over and looking at what these guys did as rookies. Jackson Smith-Njigba comes out and he has to compete with some solid options, right? He has to compete with the combination of both DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, and JSN gets injured going into the season. So we want to say right now, JSN had a pretty tough spot, but ultimately he still only had 628 receiving yards through 17 games. He still only had 4 receiving touchdowns, and he was inefficient. Now, what I want to do is I want to look at what he did as a rookie and cross-reference this with every rookie season we've had since the year 2000, and then look at what they did going into their second seasons. So with JSN, we're going to give a respectable range. We're going to go from 2.8 receptions per game to 4.8 receptions per game. JSN was at 3.8, right? So he's right in the middle of this. We're going to go from 4.5 targets per game to 6.5 targets per game. We're going to go from 28 receiving yards per game to 48 receiving yards per game. We're going to go from 8.1 fantasy points per game to 10.1 fantasy points per game. And if we're looking at the following season, for wide receivers that finished as a wide receiver 1, that's going to be more than 16.5 points. You had 0 out of 36 guys that had similar year ones to JSN. Now, if we're going to look at a lower bar, right? Because if you draft JSN, right now he's being drafted as the wide receiver 46. You don't need him to be a wide receiver 1 for him to be a good pick. If he's a wide receiver 2, that's great. So if we're looking at wide receivers that average more than 13.5 points per game, there you had 6 out of 36 options, which is rough. It's about 16.5% that JSN has a chance to be a wide receiver 2. Those 6 names were Kenny Britt, Allen Hurns, Deontay Johnson, Darnell Jackson, John Brown, and Rod Gardner. So we can make this a little bit better for this data where we don't want to look at like day 3 guys, right? You're saying, Mason, come on, JSN was a great prospect. We have to take that into mind. We can only compare him to other wide receivers that were great prospects. Completely fair thing to say. So we're only going to look at guys that went in round 1 of the NFL draft. So here, if we look at those same markers, the 2.8 receptions, the 4.8, et cetera, but only look at it for round 1 wide receivers, you only have 8, 9 guys that actually comp similarly to JSN that were round 1 guys. Still, of course, 0 of those players ended up being wide receiver 1s the following year. However, 2 of those 9 ended up being wide receiver 2s the following season. That's up to about 22.5% chance that JSN has to be a wide receiver 2 in fantasy. You have Kenny Britt, Rod Gardner as the guys that were able to do it. Just to give you some other information, the other round 1 guys that comp similarly to JSN included Rashad Bateman, Travis Taylor, Tavon Austin, Kadarius Toney, Treylon Burks. Those were the other round 1 rookie wide receivers to have similar rookie seasons to Jackson Smith-Njigba. Now, of course, we have to consider the catalyst that JSN has where it's going to make his year 2 different than what you saw in year 1. In year 2 with JSN, this is a new coaching staff where people are excited that they think they're going to come in and they are going to actually fuel and be more pass happy than what we saw with Pete Carroll. So if you do end up getting 4 to 5 additional, say, passing attempts from Geno Smith, or Geno Smith goes out there and Geno Smith takes a massive leap forward, if the volume is there, you could potentially see JSN have a better chance than 22.5%. It would be different if Tyler Lockett wasn't here anymore. It would be different if you potentially, say, had, I don't know, maybe no DK Metcalf. Then all of a sudden we can say, okay, yeah, it's a completely different situation than what he had last year. But other than the coaching staff change, it is very similar. I mean, you can go ahead and you can look at the current projections that you have right now, say on Underdog for Geno Smith's passing volume this season. You currently have Geno Smith at 22.5 passing touchdowns and about 3,400 passing yards. And if you cross-reference this with what Geno did last season, Geno was at 3,600 passing yards last year. Geno was at 20 passing touchdowns. So the current pick'ems on Underdog, the current projections, which you can go take higher or lower on, right? I mean, these should be at least about as close to accurate as you're going to find. It doesn't have Geno as taking some massive step forward with the overall passing volume this season. So specifically, I am underweight Jackson Smith-Njigba currently in drafts. I am completely fine with him in the wide receiver rankings, right? Because you go ahead and you look at where JSN's currently ranked. JSN is going as like the wide receiver 46. Wide receiver 46, Great price tag. I think there you do have a lot of upside, even if he only has a 30% chance or whatever it may be to be a wide receiver 2 this season. If he's going alongside Deontay Johnson, if he's going alongside Christian Watson, completely understandable. I think you pulled the trigger there. If you're in a redraft league with your buddies and you get him as your wide receiver 5 and say you take that in round 10, round 11, immaculate. I think the upside's there. My issue personally with JSN and why I have not drafted a lot this year on Underdog is just I personally prefer the other positions in this range. I think that after round 6 in Underdog drafts, you are seeing that tier drop. JSN's going in round 7. And would I rather have JSN or David Montgomery? Would I rather have JSN or Alvin Kamara? Would I rather have JSN or Evan Ingram? Personally, I'm going to be avoiding the wide receivers in this range. So I have not drafted a lot of JSN specifically in round 7 of Underdog drafts. But like I said, wide receiver 46, I think for the range of outcomes, perfectly fine wide receiver ranking. The issue is just going to be the overall ranking that you have specifically in Underdog drafts. I'd rather grab wide receivers earlier. So in round 7, I don't have to be taking one. Now let's move over to Quinton Johnson because Johnston had a much worse rookie season. I know we have them in the same video. They're both round 1 rookie wide receivers that busted, but I want to be very clear with you. Jackson Smith-Njigba had a much better rookie season than Quinton Johnston. JSN is much more likely to be good this next season than Johnston is. And that's why JSN's a lot more expensive in drafts right now. Because like we said, JSN's a round 7 pick. Quinton Johnson goes past pick 150. Now, just to be straight with you and show you how bad Quinton Johnston was this past year. Keenan Allen only plays 13 games. Mike Williams only plays 3 games. Joshua Palmer only plays 11 games. Austin Eckler only plays 14. There were weeks where Quinton Johnson played all 17, right? There were weeks where you had Justin Herbert, Quinton Johnston, and Diddley Squat. There was nobody else on this roster, and Johnston saw targets just because he had to. He had 67 targets because everybody else was injured. And with these, here were the wide receivers that averaged more receiving yards per game than Johnson in this offense. Keenan Allen, duh. Mike Williams, duh. Joshua Palmer over double the receiving production of Quinton Johnston. Austin Eckler. A. Erickson. I don't even remember who this is. And Gerald Everett. Gerald Everett averaged more receiving yards per game than Quinton Johnston when Johnson was put into the perfect situation this past season. Now we go over and look at wide receivers that had a similar rookie year to Quinton Johnston. That's going to be anywhere from 1.2 receptions per game to 3.2. That's going to be 2.8 targets per game to 4.8. It's going to be 15 receiving yards to 35. It's going to be from 4.6 to 6.6. You had 98 guys. One of them was a wide receiver 1 the following year. That was Brandon Marshall. 3 of them were wide receiver 2s the following season. That was Brandon Marshall, Michael Gallup, Nate Burleson. So just with the raw numbers, you have about a 3% chance for Quinton Johnston to be a wide receiver 2 the next year. Now, very similar to what we did with Jackson Smith-Njigba, right? It's not fair to stop there. We need to go through. We need to look at the round 1 guys. So moving this over and essentially filtering it down to round 1 players only. Out of those 9 guys, 0 of them were wide receiver 1s the next year. 0 of them were wide receiver 2s the next season. Just to let you know, the guys that comp similarly, Demaryius Thomas, obviously Thomas later on in his career, phenomenal fantasy asset, one of the best. Ted Ginn Jr., Reggie Wayne, David Terrell, Troy Williamson, Roddy White, Mike Williams in Detroit. You had some solid names here. You had Roddy White. You had Reggie Wayne. You had Demaryius Thomas. The issue is none of these guys did anything in year 2. It took them significantly longer to recover from how bad their year 1 was for them to develop later on in their NFL career. I would love to come out here and say you can't draft Quinton Johnston because of this data. If we think about how the situation has changed, however, clearly now you have no Austin Eckler, you have no Mike Williams, you have no Keenan Allen. They draft Ladd McConkey round 2. I'm not a big Ladd fan. They signed DJ Chark to a nothing deal. I've drafted a lot of DJ Chark just because he's free in round 18. But ultimately, they don't really do much at wide receiver. They add in Ladd. A running back, you're not going to have an Austin Eckler taking a massive target share away from the receivers here. And most importantly, if we go over and we look at how cheap Quinton Johnson is right now, he's the wide receiver 68 in these drafts. So based off, I mean, him being a wide receiver 68, you drafting him as a wide receiver 7, the historical comps being like Demaryius Thomas, Reggie Wayne, Roddy White, like those guys are mixed in. The coaching staff change possibly helps Johnston. I am okay drafting Quinton Johnson in Underdog best ball drafts because say you draft Johnston in Underdog and you draft him as a wide receiver 7 and he turns out to be a wide receiver 3, immaculate, you smash that pick. However, in your regular redraft league, if you draft him as a wide receiver 7, he turns out to be a wide receiver 3, it's a wasted roster spot, right? It doesn't matter if you're in an ESPN league, we're going to start 2 wide receivers, 1 flex. So in your regular redraft league with your college buddies, don't even bother looking at Quinton Johnson. Specifically in Underdog drafts, however, where wide receiver production so hard to find late, he's the wide receiver 68, so it's already priced in that he's an absolute nothing. He's going alongside Darnell Mooney. Darnell Mooney's going before he is. Jermaine Burton, Adam Thielen, Demario Douglas. That point, I am completely fine taking Johnson, even though I understand more likely than not, I mean, he is an NFL bust. He's most likely nothing. I could say the same thing about these other wide receivers in this range this next season. So overall, I want to reiterate, JSN, a good pick if you get him at wide receiver 46 and your regular redraft league with your high school buddies, because I think you're going to be able to get him in the double-digit rounds. I think Bryce Young is not someone worth drafting in your regular redraft league, but I think that there's enough upside for improvement in year 2 where if you wanted to take a shot on someone like Jonathan Brooks, I'm okay with it. With Quinton Johnston, there's not enough upside to take in your regular redraft league, but when his price is this depressed in Underdog best ball drafts, when taking a wide receiver 7 that could potentially turn into a wide receiver 3 actually gives you some positive value, there I'm okay drafting Quinton Johnson specifically on Underdog, and your regular redraft league with your college buddies, don't worry about it. But I think that's all I got for you. Really hope you enjoyed this video. Really hope that this data was able to help you out. And yeah, if you want to check out any of the pick'ems that we showed during this video, if you want to hop in a draft with us, I mean, hell, we are drafting every single day. Like I've already said, done it every day for years. It's best ball, no time commitment during this season. It's how we won 150,000 2 years ago. You can find that link in the description, find in the comment section. Code FLOCK will hook you up with my 2024 rankings, my draft guide, and a 50% deposit bonus up to $250 next year. But that's all I got for you. I really appreciate you. Really hope you have a great day and hope we get to see you out with the video sometime soon.